The urbanization during the Protopalatial period was not restricted to only the palaces. A notable number of settlements, which had been small to medium settlements during the pre-palatial, became full-fledged towns. The population as a whole boomed and increased at a hitherto unprecedented level. Infrastructure, such as roads both inside and between urban centers, along with drains to collect water and mitigate flooding, were all constructed at most Minoan towns. Around these urban centers, such as palaces and towns, small villages, hamlets and individual farms started to litter the landscape, all connected to the greater palace economy. Life on Crete had by now become socially and economically much more complex. The palace became the central figure in the emergence of a regional palace state which exercised political authority over the nearby region. To effectively administrate, control and tax the inhabitants within your state, there is a need for a written language. And it is not unsurprising that we see two new types of script appear during the Protopalatial period, around the Middle Minoan II period, about 1850 BC, both connected to the administration of the palaces and trade. The two scripts, Cretan Hieroglyphics and Linear A, initially show regional distribution. In the north and east, Petras, Malia and Knossos produced clay documents utilizing Cretan hieroglyphics, while around central and southern Crete, Linear A was most common, chiefly found at Phaistos and Knossos. The two scripts coexisted within most palaces. They seem to have both been used for administrative purposes and trade, but Linear A seemed to have seen more extensive use amongst religious and cult items. Evans initially hypothesized that Linear A was developed from Cretan hieroglyphics. He saw Linear A as a more developed and standardized cursive version of the Cretan hieroglyphics. As time transpired, we now have a great deal of examples of Middle Minoan II Cretan hieroglyphics in eastern and north-central Crete, and numerous examples of Linear A clay documents from the Middle Minoan II period at both Phaistos and Knossos. It is quite apparent that the two scripts were contemporary, and it seems more plausible that the two constituted two different forms of scripts. Basically, both scripts were in use during the Protopalatial period, but at the destructive episode during the Middle Minoan III period, a cultural shift seemed to have moved the whole island away from Cretan hieroglyphics. And as we enter the late Minoan 1A period, so the Neopalatial period, Linear A becomes the defining script of the Minoans. Now, what made the whole island unify under a single common script is not known, but we can imagine that the hegemony of Knossos initiated a political and cultural shift towards a single script after the Protopalatial. But there exists a problem. There is an even earlier script, a written script which goes back to the late pre-Palatial period, so before the palaces, the early Minoan III period, circa 2100 BC. Around Archanes Furni and some of the tallest tombs of the Messera, seals with pictograms constituting a unique script were found dating to before the Protopalatial period, so before the palaces. First of all, there is doubt as to whether Archanes script is a script in itself or just a set of signs used for sealing documents, probably carried by the local elite, similar to medieval heraldry, a form of identifier. It doesn't help that only a small number of seals bearing the pictograms of the script have ever been found, limiting our understanding of Archanes script even more. But if Archanes script constitutes a form of script, we find ourselves with three possible scenarios. Either it is its own separate script, which would make it the oldest in the Aegean, or it is an early form of Cretan hieroglyphs, or even potentially an early form of Linear A, or possibly both. Currently, Archanes script is commonly grouped in as an example of Cretan hieroglyphics, indicating that Cretan hieroglyphics would predate Linear A by nearly 2 centuries. The main justification for connecting Archanes script with Cretan hieroglyphics is the tradition of engraving seals with the script. Linear A, on the other hand, can mainly be found on clay documents, and only a very small number of sealings engraved with linear A writing have ever been found. This doesn't mean that there isn't a deeper evolutionary connection between linear A and Archanes script, and of course the chronology of literacy on Crete is still much debated. So how did these two writing systems, Cretan hieroglyphics and linear A, function? Sadly, neither scripts have been deciphered, but luckily, linear A would, during the period of the Mycenaean overtaking of Crete, so during the Neopalatial period about 1470 BC, be adapted into a separate script called linear B, which was deciphered in 1952 by a British architect, Michael Ventris, with a great private interest in philology and decipherment. Michael was able to connect the phonetics of an Iron Age writing system from Cyprus with that of linear B, enabling him to use the Cypriot writing system as a Rosetta Stone to decrypt linear B. So, having deciphered linear B, we do have a certain insight into the nature of linear A, as linear B is developed from linear A. And as linear A was the preferred writing system of the Minoans during the Neopalatial period, the number of linear A documents uncovered far outweighs the number of Cretan hieroglyphic documents uncovered. We can still say something about how it seems these writing systems would have worked, even if they aren't deciphered. So let's take a simplified look at a few writing systems commonly used around the world. We have the alphabet, like the Latin alphabet, where each sign denotes either a consonant or a vowel. Then we have so-called syllabaries, where each sign denotes a combination of a consonant followed by a vowel, such as the Japanese writing system hiragana and katakana. The last writing system to discuss are logographic systems, where each sign or logogram either represent a part of the word or the whole word itself, such as in Mandarin or Japanese kanji. The key difference between these writing styles, and there are others as well, is that in both alphabets and syllabaries, each sign represents a sound, while in logographic systems, each sign, or so-called logogram, has an inherent meaning, representing an item or an idea. So, what writing system does Cretan hieroglyphics and linear A fit into? Both writing systems are so-called logosyllabic, in that there exist signs which are syllabic and are grouped together creating words, but there are also logograms, signs which in themselves represent a quantity, an item, or an idea. Cretan hieroglyphs consist of around 90 syllabograms, signs representing syllables, and around 30 logograms. As we lack any extensive remains of the script, we are generally forced to rely on deduction and general interpretation to get a rudimentary grip on the script, chiefly using our understanding of linear B to interpret both linear A and Cretan hieroglyphics. Looking at some of the signs from Cretan hieroglyphic documents, we find some signs which are easy to interpret. The head of a bovine of some sort, probably an ox, two ram's head in similar style, and a branch which probably represents olives from an olive tree, or quite possibly flax, a plant used to produce cloth in the form of linen. And then there's also two examples of a very interesting sign, the so-called labris, or the double-sided axe, which would function as a cult item for the Minoans, a very sacred religious symbol. On one tablet where we find the labris, we also find a small line in the top left of the clay document. This is the remains of a cross, which would have indicated the beginning of a word and what direction to read from. In this case, from left to right, starting with the sign representing the labris, then a sign representing cloth, and last the sign for some type of bovine. So these three symbols may represent three syllabograms, basically a group of three syllables creating a word. If we compare these signs with similar signs from linear B, this word could potentially be read as A-wa-di, but of course we sadly do not know. The usage of the cross as an indication of a new sign group and the direction of reading is unique to Cretan hieroglyphics when compared to other languages from the Aegean. We can see a use of the cross sign in this seal from Malia. We have an initial sign which probably was a logogram for figs, followed by the dividing cross, indicating that the seal should be read from left to right. It gets easier as we start to study Linear A. As I mentioned before, we can get a pretty good understanding of Linear A by inference from what we know from Linear B. Some have suggested that Linear A is part of the Indo-European language family, as it carries some similarities with other scripts from the region, such as Carian, Cypriot, Hurrian, and Lycian, but most suggest that the Minoan language was not Indo-European. However, just like Cretan hieroglyphics, Linear A was a logosyllabic writing system, and of the about 90 syllabograms found in Linear A, around 70 have parallels in Linear B. Many of these also seem to have parallels with signs from Cretan hieroglyphics. The main difference when comparing the two writing systems is the script style. Linear A is, as would be expected, drawn more using linear lines, and the signs are less artistical but more standardized. Cretan hieroglyphics have the benefit of being more pictorial, conveying the meaning of the sign through its design. Linear A, on the other hand, is less intuitive, more difficult to figure out what the sign represents just by viewing the sign alone. If we view some of the remaining Linear A tablets, we do find many signs with parallels within Cretan hieroglyphics. We see the labris, the double axe, the sign for wine, and also the sign for figs. But one of the truly interesting features of Linear A is the emergence of the Aegean numerals, basically the Greek Bronze Age decimal system, a system which will survive throughout the Bronze Age around the Aegean, used both in Linear A and Linear B. Vertical lines denotes ones, horizontal lines denotes tens, and circles denotes 100. So if we look at any Linear A tablet, we can quickly see the Aegean numerals being used. For example, at this tablet from Petrus, we have two known signs, one for wheat and one which indicates humans or men. So if we read the two last lines of the tablet, it says men 72, wheat 26. This is undoubtedly some form of ledger connected to the administration of the small palace at Petrus, potentially a tax document indicating a region with 72 inhabitants who were due to pay 26 units of wheat or similar grain. For those interested, there is a lot of academics and hobbyists who try to decipher these tablets in Linear A using what we know from Linear B. Most of these texts were connected with the administration of the palace, but the undoubtedly best known example of Minoan script and Bronze Age writing in the Aegean as a whole is the Phaistos Disc, found in the northeastern workshops at Phaistos, dated to around the Middle Minoan Free period, the beginning of the Neopalatial period. So after the destruction of the Protopalatial palace at Phaistos, during a very difficult period in Phaistos history, where the settlement tried to recover from destruction, but ultimately recurring earthquakes destroyed any efforts to construct a new palace until the late Minoan 1B period. The script, however, is not Linear A, as would be expected for any Minoan document from the Neopalatial period, especially considering that it was found at Phaistos, basically the home of Linear A writing. Neither is it written using Cretan hieroglyphics. It is an unknown writing system. The script has some parallels from other Minoan writing systems, but as a whole it is a completely separate writing system, never seen before. The main feature of the script is the vertical lines, which you can see very clearly. They separate signs into groups, probably words. So we find that these sign groups contain at least 2 signs and at the most 7 signs. In total, there are 241 signs, probably syllabograms, grouped into 61 sign groups, so a total of 61 words. It is also presumed that these signs were not etched into the clay, but instead stamped by metal seals, which is why you see no variation between identical signs. So what was the function of the Phaistos Disc? Well, it was probably meant to function as a religious item, read from the center to the outside. We can guess that this was the intended direction to read the disc due to the anthropomorphic signs of humans and faces, which are directed from left to right. But also, if the disc was written from outside in, there is a real risk of accidentally smudging the soft clay, making it more practical to write from the center to the outside. However, others have stated that the line with the dots at the outer edge of the disc indicates the starting point of the text, but even Evans regarded the center to be the start. The disc was probably a form of hymn or chant, just given by the number of repeated sign groups which we can see on both sides. Repetition of specific words or sentences are typical for religious hymns. Think of just some general religious psalms or chants. But also consider, Phaistos had just suffered apocalyptic destruction around half a century before the creation of the disc. Appeasing the gods would have been very important in the minds of the population at Phaistos, so it is quite probable that the disc and its writing aimed to appease the gods. It is an interesting artifact by all means, and even though multiple attempts have been made to decipher the script in itself is one of the most enigmatic features of the Minoan civilization, and if the disc is ever to be deciphered, it will probably be through either Linear A or Cretan hieroglyphics. So leaving scripts, we now have to discuss a type of item which goes beyond the palace and its administration, items we have mentioned before, namely the seal. The use of seals predate the palaces. At a point in time in the early Minoan II period, they start to pop up throughout the Aegean, found both on mainland Greece and the Cycladic islands. On Crete, there is no geographical limit in terms of seal usage. They can be found on settlements all throughout the island. The function of a seal is quite simple. It is basically a stamp. It is constructed using either a piece of soft or hard stone, minerals, gems, bones, or ivory. The flat side of the seal is then polished and engraved either with a figure, a pattern, or later during the palace period, an inscription. When it is pressed into clay or any other malleable material, the engraving leaves an impression. In a sense, the glyptic, so the engraved figure or pattern, so to say, of the seal, is an identifier, a sign connected to the wearer or the authority of the wearer in terms of palace administration. During the Prepalatial, we find many seals deposited as grave goods in tombs, and since grave goods were mostly personal items connected to the deceased, seals and their engraving must have been connected to the wearer in some sense. They were probably not used as administrative items during the Prepalatial in the same sense as seals during the palace period, but instead possibly as personal or status identifiers. The first examples from the Prepalatial period sport simple motifs, generally symmetric geometric patterns or possibly animals. They were all pierced so that they easily could be suspended, probably around the wearer's neck as an amulet. Later seals towards the end of the Prepalatial start to display a common set of motifs, a standardization in seal engraving, indicating a more specialized production around Crete, with some artisans producing a very large number of seals. Specialized production also resulted in more complex engravings, but also more elaborate designs of the seal itself, which start to take form of animals, such as this bird-shaped seal from the tomb at Comasa, or a seal shaped like a monkey, along with some so-called white pieces, seals in the form of often a scarab, a very common motif from Egypt. A impressive but complex pattern, which becomes very popular towards the end of the Prepalatial, are spiral patterns, especially of lions moving in a parade around the center of the round seal. This truly shows the remarkable skill exhibited by the artisans as we enter into the palace period. So how did seals change during the Protopalatial period? In reality, not that much. Patterns became less geometrical and more sophisticated, moving from simple geometric patterns to more naturalistic and abstract motifs, as well as having Linear A and Cretan hieroglyphic script engraved on the seals. Bones and ivory, which was commonly used for constructing seals during the Prepalatial, became less popular. Instead, soft stones became the standard, along with examples of seals made of hard stones and gemstones, which now could be carved and engraved thanks to new tools. These hardstone and gemstone seals were far more durable, but of course less malleable, requiring further specialization and more advanced tools. We also start to see seals with a noticeable handle, which will make them far easier to use when stamping multiple items, indicating the need for some seals to be ergonomically suitable for administrative use, just giving us an idea of the extent of the palace bureaucracy. We also find some seals with multiple engraved surfaces, which would allow the user to use one seal for multiple purposes. These seals are indicative of just the extensive bureaucracy found within the palace administration, although it should be said that multi-sided seals do predate the palaces. This, for example, is a 6-sided seal, dated to just before the Protopalatial period, created using softstone, typical for the pre-palatial period. Seal rings are very impressive types of seals, often made using beautiful lustrous metals and elaborate patterns, but they are not a common feature of the Protopalatial period. However, some examples have been found, but they do become more common during the Neopalatial period and the Mycenaean period, so the final palace period that follows. Like this seal or signet ring, the so-called Ring of Minos from the end of the Neopalatial period, around 1450 BC. During the Protopalatial, most seals were created using soft materials such as steatite, sometimes called soapstone, along with ivory, as the technique of efficiently handling stronger materials had yet to be perfected. But as we shall see, during the Neopalatial period, Minoan artisans would become skilled enough to furnish seals from most materials. A last form of seal worth mentioning are cylindrical seals, an interesting type of seal which originated in the Near East and arrived around the late pre-palatial period on Crete, probably from Anatolia or Syria. Now these seals were different from most Minoan seals, which were stamped. Instead, they were rolled along a clay surface for the pattern of the seal to be edged into the clay. These seals are just incredible, as such a small cylindrical piece of stone can create such an impressive image. You can see the resulting impression created by the seal to the left when rolled in clay. The seal can also be rolled for long distances, creating a sort of repeating pattern mural with impressive scenes echoing those of Egyptian murals, but of course at a smaller scale. So, with an understanding of these tools and writing systems, which basically enabled large-scale palace administration, let's dive into the administrative procedures and documents which were used by the administrators within the palace. A key difference we can quickly discern is the preference of different types of documents administrators tended to use when using either Cretan hieroglyphics or linear A. There is quite a variety of administrative types of clay documents, far more than most would imagine, and with documents I refer to clay pieces used within the bureaucracy of the palace. Now it is worthwhile to get a good grasp of these documents, so let's go through the most common ones, but do remember there are a lot of variation to each one of these documents, and this is an effort to summarize and to simplify. So probably the most typical form of ancient record keeping are clay tablets, a great way to tally up resources and keeping information on a single document. These were commonly not sealed, instead inscribed with a written language, nearly exclusively linear A. Clay nodules were another type of palace document of great importance. Nodules are basically small clay lumps which were often sealed and sometimes inscribed with a writing system. So nodules served various functions, generally thought of as a form of receipt or maybe a token, which were given to an individual in return for a service. So if a worker or an artisan produced a number of wares for the palace, the sealed nodule could be used as a receipt for collecting payment. Other nodules were pierced and could therefore be hung up around, for example, an amphora or a piphoi, functioning as a label for the container, indicating, for example, the content or the owner or possibly the function of the vessel. They could also be used as a necklace or a wristband, a type of religious charm or possibly an identifier. But probably the most intriguing form of nodules are those which are proposed to have been used to seal parchment, which could basically not be opened without breaking the clay sealing, indicating that other types of materials than clay were used for record keeping. Many times the nodule was placed directly on an item, such as a jar or a chest, and then sealed as a way of indicating ownership, content, or potentially function. Even on some hollow objects, such as a pithoi or an amphora, the spout or the mouth of the vessel was sealed by a lump of clay, which was then sealed itself, resulting in the content being safely contained until someone broke the sealed clay lump. This is called direct object sealing and were a typical form of palace document during the Protopalatial period, but far less common during the Neopalatial. Next we have roundels, and roundels are quite an interesting type of clay document. They are basically rounded discs made of clay, inscribed on either one or both sides. Here for example we have a roundel inscribed using linear A with what we can assume to be the sign for tripods. Then along the edge we find some dimples which regularly occurs as if to make it easy to hold or something. But in each of these dimples is the impression of a seal, which have been stamped into the side multiple times. The exact function of these documents are probably similar to that of the nodule, some form of receipt or label. The use of seals around the disc has some function which gives the roundel another dimension of use. Some have hypothesized that the number of times the side was sealed indicates the quantity of a specific resource. But of course, this is just speculation. Clay bars are a common type of clay document inscribed with Cretan hieroglyphics. They are either thin sheets inscribed on two sides, or others have a triangular form and are inscribed on three sides. It is somewhat difficult to get a good perspective on this bar, but it is shaped as a triangle. But the most common form of bars were rectangular square bars which were inscribed on all four sides. Some of these were also pierced, which allowed for the bar to be suspended with a string. We can for example see the pierced hole here on this two-sided bar. Now the two-sided bars are mostly oblong and generally sporting a form of suspension hole, which indicates that they either function as a type of label or potentially a way of structuring information about, for example, nearby regions, such as livestock and population. If anything were to change, it is far easier to replace a two-sided bar than a whole table. As you can see, there are quite a few number of suspended clay documents. Amongst them were also medallions, so small clay discs which sported a small suspension hole, and also cones which were pierced through the middle and inscribed along the outside face. So what can we say about these documents in relation to script and seals? In terms of seals, nodules and roundels were commonly stamped with a seal, while tablets, bars, medallions and cones were mostly inscribed using either linear A or Cretan hieroglyphics. In terms of script, there is a lot of overlap. Most document types have been found inscribed with both linear A and Cretan hieroglyphics, but we can generalize and say that tablets and roundels are typically inscribed with linear A, while bars, cones and medallions are typically inscribed with Cretan hieroglyphics. Suspended nodules are very common in both writing systems, however, it is not uncommon to find documents inscribed with linear A and then sealed with Cretan hieroglyphics, which just indicates the extensive complexity of the Minoan bureaucracy during the First Palace period.